Capstone. I'm Jessica Locka, and my topic is the stalling of the sexual revolution, a critical analysis of the current representation of the sexual double standard. The sexual double standard occurs in many areas of our daily lives, both personally and professionally. Most often we see it occur in the workplace and in the bedroom. Basically, it occurs whenever the genders are held to different standards. For my study, I chose to focus on the sexual double standard that judges individuals based on their sexual behavior. To do this, I used a critical discourse analysis of literature to evaluate potential change in the sexual double standard. Basically, this means I analyzed literature for themes and language that are used to discuss the sexual double standard, as I will mention later. I hypothesized that the sexual double standard has become more like the contemporary view, which I will mention in a moment. Basically, this means it has become more implicit and subtle than in previous years, and additionally, it's more connected to the socialization of genders. So, when designing this study, I used 4 research articles primarily. The first was a literature review by Crawford and Pop, 2003, in which they discussed the 3 views that the sexual double standard is based off of. The first is the orthodox view, which centers around the norm that it is not acceptable to have sex prior to marriage or outside of marriage. The second is the traditional view, which centers around the norm that sex is not allowed outside of a committed relationship, or casual sex basically is not allowed, no hookups, no nothing like that. And basically that was developed in the 1960s. The final view is the contemporary view, as I mentioned earlier. It's still based around the same norm as the traditional view, however, it is a lot more subtle and implicit, and it's harder to measure with explicit measures, which I will mention in a moment. The second study by Morgan, Thorne, and I believe it's Briggan, 2010, it discusses the socialization of the sexual double standard, and basically they asked students what their parents told them about sex, and the study found that males primarily received messages that sex is normal and it's natural, and engaging in it is good, whereas they did not receive any restrictive messages. In contrast, females only receive restrictive messages, such as not engaging in sex, the implications of engaging in casual sex, and they did not receive any messages about sex being natural or normal. For the last 2 studies, the first by Allison and Risman, 2013, the second by Brodlava, Buckberg, and Rieger, 2014, discussed a 4th view, which is the permissive view, and that focuses on the norm that having a high number of sexual partners is not acceptable. You want to lower as low a number as possible. So this leads into my procedure. So for this study, I collected 10 peer-reviewed articles from EBSCOhost using the search term the sexual double standard. For my measures, I based them off a discourse analysis by Crawford and Pop and the terms discussed in the work by Allison and Risman and then Morgan et al. And for my research design, I used existing research to answer 6 major questions about the sexual double standard. The first being, what does or did the sexual double standard look like? And this was broken into 2 categories, either the traditional view, which as I mentioned before, centers around the norm that sex outside of a committed relationship is not okay, or the permissive view, that the lower number you have, the better off you are, and the higher number, the more rejected you are by your peers and your family. The second question, how is or was the sexual double standard identified, was broken either into explicit measures or implicit measures. Explicit measures are those that you might find on a common questionnaire like rating scales or closed-ended questions, while implicit measures allow participants to give open responses to maybe hypothetical situations or just one major overall question in general. Additionally, this would include interviews. For the third question, where has the sexual double standard been found, it's either in the college setting or the general population. For this, I chose general population as anything that was not the college setting, whereas college setting, anything that took place on a college campus. For the fourth question, what are the potential causes of the sexual double standard? I selected 2 categories, either socially linked or value linked. For socially linked, these are studies in which participants' responses were linked to social learning from family or peers. Specifically, they would mention social rejection, isolation from their peer group, loss of self-esteem, or potential loss of acceptance by family members. Whereas value-linked, they would specifically mention either cultural beliefs or religious beliefs. And then for the last two questions, how do women exemplify the sexual double standard and how do men exemplify the sexual double standard? I used the same categories. There were 3 in total. The first being the traditional double standard, which is the idea that men can engage in sexual behavior while women are not allowed to. The second is the egalitarian sexual double standard, and this is one in which both sexes are held to the same standard, whether it be they're praised for their behavior or rejected for it. The third is the reverse double standard, in which women are praised for their sexual behavior and men are rejected. So, basically, the findings by questions, I asked the first two questions I asked were based on appearance of the sexual double standard, and the findings showed that it was primarily the traditional view. Again, this means that it's centered around the norm of no casual sex, hookups, or anything outside of a committed relationship. While, and the measures most likely used were explicit, and they found the same sexual double standard that they've been finding for over, I believe, 20 years now. And then the last two questions of men versus women. Women showed all 3 types of the sexual double standard. However, the most commonly found was the traditional. And men only were shown to exemplify the traditional double standard. So the causes and origins. For the cause, I found that most likely it was linked to socialization. So there were the responses about it being socially linked, whether they talked about their family rejecting them or their peers, or them being thought of as like a slut or a whore because they did something. And then the origin would be the college setting. And although there was some support for the general population, most of my research stated the college setting primarily. And how this relates to my original hypothesis, which was, just to remind you since that was a lot of information, the sexual double standard has become more like the contemporary view, which means that it's implicit, and then I also believe that it would be socially linked. My findings are similar in the sense that it shows a link to the socialization of genders and the way that we relate to one another, we perpetuate the sexual double standard, whereas it differed in showing that it was more in line with the traditional view and more explicit. So some limitations for this study were the amount of information gathered. Because I only had 10 articles that I gathered, that was a very small group, and additionally, it was mainly a limited population of college students, and all the studies excluded any homosexual participants. They only used heterosexuals, which leads me to my recommendations for future research. Would want to explore cultural differences because none of the studies focused on one culture over the other or how culture really affects individuals when they're thinking of the sexual double standard and their own personal values about sex. The second is the heteronormative aspects, which basically means, is this something that only heterosexuals perpetuate and believe in and uphold, or is this something that other sexualities also project onto each other? And then the final recommendation is that the sexual double standard be examined more in the general population. Most of my studies focused mainly on the college population, so it would have been nice to have seen more about whether or not this is just something that happens on a college campus versus out in the rest of the world. Here are my resources, and thank you all.